Okay. It is live. Should be. We should say that anybody wants to.
Right back to him.
Okay. Okay, let's try to get this done. We are in Perek Yud Zayin, the end of Perek Shalach, and we're going to take the last three psukim for today. Chai, if you can be kind enough to read. So that's we're in Pasuk Yud Dalet, Perek 17:14, Yud Zayin Yud Dalet.
ויאמר השם אל משה, כתוב זאת זיכרון בספר ושים באוזני יהושע, כי מחו אמחה את ספר עמלק, מתחת השמיים. And Hashem said to Moshe, write this in the book of remembrance.
In the book of remembrance?
No, write this to remember, zikaron, בספר, so in a book. Write this, remembering, zikaron, remembrance, in a book.
It says as a remembrance in the book. So is that?
I see. And sim באוזני Yoshua, and put it in the ears of Yoshua. כי מחו אמחה את זכר עמלק, because I'm going to wipe out Amalek under the sky.
So let me just pause for a second. Just the word ki, right, at the beginning. So ki is, this is actually important.
So that.
Right. So ki is what's the word?
It's one of those words. Preposition.
Yeah, no, it's not a preposition. It's like that part of speech that connects things.
Conjunction.
Is it conjunction again? That is has a spectrum of meanings when translated into English, right? So often it can mean because, right, but not always. Here it seems like maybe in order to, what is that? How does it translate at the last phrase? So that, right? And there's that the purpose of writing this in this book is connected to this idea that God is going to obliterate the memory of Amalek. Okay, fine, keep going.
We spoke about the fact that in some places it says, like here it says, God will obliterate it. In the other place, we spoke about it the last time we spoke, I don't know, that
you have
that we have a responsibility to wipe them out.
Excuse me. They also repeat so it sounds like, let's be really clear, this is really going to happen. But I don't think you want to obliterate his memory. I think you need to keep it alive so that you can.
What does the pasuk say?
Be on guard. Well, obliterate the remembrance of Amalek from under the heavens.
Right. So that's a question that we can reserve, right? What does it mean to obliterate? Why? But certainly that's the straightforward meaning of the pasuk, right? That God says that I'm going to totally erase the memory of Amalek. Fine.
We're writing in
remembrance.
Right. And again, there's this interesting kind of dichotomy there that are we remembering? Are we forgetting? Are we obliterating? Who's doing it? Why? There's a lot of stuff there. I keep going.
ויבן משה מזבח, and Moshe built an altar, ויקרא שמו השם ניסי. And he called it, Hashem is my miracle, my test.
Or perhaps my banner.
My banner.
Right.
Yeah, like a flag is also a nest.
Right.
Yeah. ויאמר, and he said, כי יד על כס ka, because I'm going to read it. Hand is on the throne of God. מלחמה להשם בעמלק מדור לדור. Hashem maintains the war against Amalek from generation to generation.
Okay, and again, who's it's a pretty obscure phrase, right?
Who is saying?
Right, who's the speaker here?
Could be Moshe, it could be Hashem.
Right.
Could be Yeshua.
That's a theoretical possibility. There's that it's I think Hashem and I think Moshe and Hashem are the front runners, right? As but that's an interesting possibility. Perhaps Yehoshua is in this scene as well, right? And that's the end of the story. And there's this last section is the end of the story of this encounter with Amalek, and we are going to transition. Again, this is something that maybe we'll even get to today. For us, we make the parsha, right, is a unit that looms very large in our minds, right? We're used to thinking about what's in this parsha, what's in that parsha. Right? And it's interesting, that we mentioned this before. The prakim, right, the chapters are not a original or Jewish division of psukim. And they're not that Parak Aleph, based all of those come from Christian sources, right? It's not we never had such a concept of those kinds of chapters. And again, that was something that was introduced largely by printers. Some people say that some of it was in order to be able to have dialogue back and forth, to respond to Christian claims, to have like a system to be able to find them. But for us, the Parshas HaShavua, which is also not an original end, but like they both in terms of the way the children are educated, the way that we consume Chumash as shulgoers, right? It's a very important thing in our heads, and overly important, right? And there's that sometimes that we, again, it's wherever we left off was a week ago, right? So, it's out of sight, out of mind. And it's important sometimes, in fact, that's why there is a value sometimes to learning out of just a straight Tanakh, right? That doesn't put the Parsha divisions onto different pages, right? And there's a Sefer Torah does not distinguish between one Parsha Shavua and the next, right? So the idea that there's perhaps more connection, right, between the end of Bishalach and the beginning of Yisro than we might ordinarily think. All of that notwithstanding, right, that this is the end of the story. Fine. Okay. I have some things to say, but
reading the weekly parsha is since when?
no. What do you mean by reading the weekly parsha?
I mean, we are like finishing the whole Torah in a year, like on Simchat Torah.
Right. So that is
When did this
so
start?
that practice started probably more than depends which piece of it. And there's the idea of finishing the Torah annually, right? Let's back up for a second, right? The institution of Kriyas HaTorah on Shabbos is very, very ancient. Maybe as far back as the time of Rosh Hashanah. What you read was very loose at one time, right? And again, that it may have been that there was a time where it was almost discretionary. In other words, the same way that somebody gives a shiur, let's say on Shabbos, right, or even a drasha for that matter, right? Our convention is to give a drasha usually about the parsha, but not necessarily, right? It's the person giving the drasha as drashas. It could be there's an event that took place in the community, in the Jewish world, that's worth addressing, and you may or may not make a nod to the Torah reading in that process. So it may well have been, right, that there was a time, right, thousands of years ago, where all there was someone would get up Shabbos morning and read from the Torah whatever they felt like, right? And it was whatever they thought was, meaningful or appropriate or whatever. In Babylonian, Bavel, probably 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, we don't really know for sure, the practice began of this idea that we're going to read the Torah over the course of a year, right? And that these were the divisions, what we call the Parshas HaShavua. Today we're kind of introduced at that time. For a long time, there's a little bit more flexibility about where they start and stop than today. In other words, as late as a few hundred years ago, there were places that in certain years would divide Mishpatim into two separate parshios, right? And it was read the first half of Mishpatim 1 week and the second half of Mishpatim another. But more or less for the last 1,000 years, these things have been frozen. But for a long time, the custom of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, right, was that they would finish the Torah over the course of 3 years, not 1 year. And that, that they maintain that custom, that they would, read the Torah over the course of 3 years. It meant the Parsha Shavua, that laning was shorter, right? And that's because you only had to cover a third of the ground in that time. They didn't really know from our idea of Parsha Shua. That wasn't part of their their experience. And they had like these smaller kinds of things. This custom continued at least until the time of the Rambam. That there was a shul in Cairo, in Fustat, of expatriate Eretz Yisrael Jews. Right, again, Eretz Yisrael at that time was in kind of a downswing in the Jewish world. There was the Crusades, and afterwards, you had a very small community of Eretz Yisrael at the time. But there were those that moved to Egypt, and there was the Eretz Yisrael shul in Fustat, and they kept this 3-year system. In fact, and that they used to go. They would daven fast on Simchas Torah, right? They would go to the main shul, to like celebrate with everybody else, right? Because that wasn't really part of their Masorah. They also didn't have 2 days of Yontif when they were still married to Israel. They didn't have a concept of.
Once every 3 years.
They didn't have a Simchas Torah. They didn't really have such a. They may have. We don't really know for sure how it was a little bit more than 3 years. It wasn't connected to Simchas Torah at all. So what's interesting is kind of when the Jewish community of Israel rebuilt itself, right? They brought what had become the universal Jewish practice of finishing in a year, right? And with that, the notion of Simchas Torah, right, which they put on Shmini Atzeres, right? And it's because there's no 9th day in Israel, right? So because they kind of, in some ways, it's like a foreign import, right? They had to kind of put it, and anybody who has, forget this here, but anybody who's ever observed Simchas Torah in Israel, it's a very weird holiday, right? Because like basically what de facto has happened is that you've stuffed 2 holidays, right? That developed independently. In Chutz La'aretz, right? In Eretz Yisrael gets celebrated on a single day. So you have this weird back and forth, right, of Hakafos and Yizkor and Geshem and like all these things that like, and it becomes like a complete balagan. It's just give me a second. I've told this story before, but I think it's an important story. I have a friend, right, who's just like a year or 2 older than me, who when he was in, I guess, 9th grade, his parents were on sabbatical in Israel. So he's this 9th grade American kid. His Hebrew is remarkable, but he very quickly gets involved with Bnei Akiva, and they're planning a like Bnei Akiva youth Simchas Torah program. I'm sure I've shared the story before. And they're talking about like what's going to be the flow of the day. And one of the things they were discussing was like when we're going to do Yizkor, and how is that going to like factor into this? And he was kind of like. And there was like, I think a lot of discussion about the story. He's like, do we really have to make like this is like a kids program? Like, do we really need to make like Yizkor? Like how many people are you saying Yizkor anyways? And there was this like very uncomfortable silence, right? Because he was born in 1973. That was the kids who were born 73, 74, right? Which meant that there was actually a significant cohort of children who were born without fathers. Fell in the Yom Kippur War. And he said that's when he like really understood the difference of what it meant to be an American versus an Israeli, as far as that's concerned. Anyway, so the answer to your question is that division it's old, but it was not always universal. It certainly is not part of the way the Torah was given. Right, and they're useful units for a lot of purposes, but we have to just be careful not to overly box ourselves into the Parsha Shavua system in terms of the way we think about things that are happening in Chumash, right? Again, another example would be the fact that the Makos, right, stops in the middle of from one parsha to the other, and the question is, does that really represent a significant change between Makkos 1 through 7 and 8 through 10, or like let's focus on the 10 Makkos and not the fact that there's an intermission, for a week, but that's open question. I'm sorry, Shoshana. I feel like I've been waiting very patiently.
No, that's okay. Related to that question, I've never really understood these Masoretic notes and what importance do they have?
Okay,
in
so
tradition?
the bottom line is they actually are, this is one of the weirdest editorial decisions that Art Scroll did of running these little Vartlach that were written by I was going to say because I was completely negative about it. So someone of stature. So basically that this is a convention that started when Tanakh was first printed. To have these little things that it's just kind of almost like a note of how many psukim are in the parsha, as well as a gematria, right? Often kind of like a clever gematria, right? That somehow thematically may be connected to the parsha in that place. And Art Scroll thought it would be like this great idea to have these little vertlach about what those gematrias mean. There is, to the best of my understanding, these may even be devices that Christian printers put into the Chumash. They don't have any kind of, they probably have some kind of like, whoever was writing them had this like kind of cutesy idea. They really are not of any actual importance, as far as I'm concerned. What do I know? But,
in the future, obviously, you don't have to do it today. I'm also curious about the Haftarah. Where did it go from?
Another time.
Another time.
I can really go into like a whole like whatever. I have a friend who's been working on this like huge project now for a few years. And he's like kind of writing it up paper by paper. And so it was eventually a book, trying to understand where the specific, because sometimes it says like Sephardim read this Haftorah, or Yemenites read this Haftorah, and so forth. And almost inevitably, the other ones feel shorter than whatever you're going to have to be there for, right? So he's actually researching the origins of the Haftorah customs and where they come from, and like basically spends like his time, on all these like sitting in the National Library in Israel looking at manuscripts of like old Chumashim and stuff like that to try to really like nail down these things, which again is one of these things that is incredibly interesting to a very, very narrow swath of people that I actually happen to be part of. So,
By the way, there is a beautiful new National Library in Israel.
Yes,
which
it
is
is
beautiful.
I have been
And it's
there
worth
also. Yeah, it's
going.
very, very beautiful.
And maybe making an appointment before you go.
Yeah,
Meet
Where
you
is
one
it?
or
Yeah.
two.
Right.
It's next to the Knesset, right in that area.
Yeah, it's the same area that was in.
Right.
Yeah, so I happen to be like
You made an appointment.
I have a bunch of friends who like spend a lot of time hanging out there. So it's kind of and I was there when I was in Israel in November. At the time they had this shares with somebody this like these really stunning tributes to the hostages, which I think is probably smaller.
Books,
Yeah, so basically they went through, they had chairs, right, set up for each of the hostages with a book that somehow was connected, not necessarily to the person, but like the age and the themes. And it was really like very, again, you have to be able to like, understand what the titles mean and so forth. But it was kind of a remarkable kind of presentation. Yeah.
We have a friend in Wexner Fellow who just made a presentation at a conference a couple months ago. She's in charge of collecting all the artifacts and stories from October 7th. And the presentation was on the challenges of doing that. But it's not only photographs and video clip, it's so many artifacts, and the collection from the National Library is so broad that I sent Rabbi Yolkut a message that she's collecting Divrei Torah that were made by American rabbis around that time. Also, that's part of the collection.
It's by the way, it's very interesting. This is, Eric Luigi did this, spent a lot of time dealing with this in terms of October 27th. It's interesting that this, I think it's kind of new, this like proactive stance by archivists, librarians, and so forth, that like when something happens, realizing that like instead of somebody sitting down 30 years later trying to figure out, trying to find the stuff of like, to warehouse it now when it's easily available and findable. It's an interesting kind of thing, right? Which is again, even in terms of just family stories and family histories, in terms of the kinds of things that again you can turn into like kind of kind of pathological pack rat with this mentality. So like take it with a grain of salt. But like the idea of like storing away certain kinds of things for the future, right? That people should be able to have access to stuff like that.
Here it says store the memory.
Oh, good. Thank you for getting that. Okay, good. No, thank you so much. Okay, good. Let's back to the pursuit. Okay, so we have here any other thoughts, questions, comments? Again, I still want to be reserving analysis. I just point out things that interest you. Understand that you want to discuss further these three.
What book is
Okay, good question, right? What does he mean? Write this in a book. Good. What book? What's the book?
maybe the Chumash?
Good. We'll talk about it in a second. Any other questions?
I don't understand this.
Good. Tell me what you don't understand.
Wording. Put it in the ears of Yehoshua as opposed to saying tell or give over to Yehoshua. I don't mean to nitpick, but it's
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's a
if no word in the Torah is extraneous or inappropriate, then why do like if I tell Bobby something, I'm just going to tell her. I'm not going to tell it into her ears.
So again, I'll take it into one second and go back to the point that assumption that not every word is extraneous is not shared by all Mepharshim. That is the case. The second thing I want to say about that, which again is that it depends what you mean by extraneous. In other words, sometimes, right, we use language, right, for a certain kind of effect, right, rather than to communicate an idea per se, right? In other words, like sometimes we use, we might choose a word, for instance, depending on the setting, right, for its onomatopoetic value. There's the idea that the sound, right, of that word, right, enhances the way that that we experience, right? Or you think about tools like alliteration, right? So I remember when it was Rabbi Lam's was very well known for as a speaker that he would have these all of these flourishes of the same consonant 5 times in a row or something like that, which again as a student is very easy to parody that kind of that. So sometimes that's at play, but it's a question of, and I would say just very quickly, and we could talk more about it, that there is something very formal, right, about the way that this is being phrased, right? And this is not simply a conversation, but it's almost like you can see the capital letters, right, in this phrase, and that's a little bit of a different modality. But I had not actually thought of that specific angle of put in the ear. So we'll come back to that, right? Maybe it's an early reference to Hamantasha. Shoshana, you had a question?
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading a book some time ago by somebody, Robert Alter, maybe,
Okay.
about the poetic phrasing sometimes.
Yeah.
Like I can't remember I can't remember what the
So
form is. But so how does what you're describing go along with pardes like Bashad, Remez, Drasha, so that idea, or I'm wondering how that gels.
So again, that my quick answer, right, is that if you take that particular idea, so I'm not dealing with the sod at all. In other words, that's for whoever's dealing with sod to figure out how that works, right? In other words, saying on a pshat level, right? In other words, that and again, it would seem to me that one would argue that there may be different sections in Chumash, right, where one of those things, right, is more dominant than the other, right? Again, one of the issues that I've been thinking about, but it's more kind of I should think about that, and has been coming up, and I've thought about it and then dismissed it, is that we're not very far away, even in our pace, right, from getting to kind of the halachic psukim, right? There's especially when it comes to Parshat Mishpatim, right? Parshat Mishpatim is all of these halachos, right? And there, to a large degree, the question of how to learn those psukim in this group, I'm not really sure, right? And there is that kind of, because there is the primary significance of those psukim is how are they interpreted and applied as a basis of halacha, which is not the same way really that we learn, right? Usually in terms of what's happening. So I don't really know what I'm going to do with that. I think it's a little bit of time to figure it out. But in other words, that perhaps is related to, in other words, the idea that for those that I'm not responsible for every level of understanding, those have to, kind of work themselves out. Yeah.
You might have already answered this, but if Hashem is inscribing this in a book, why does somebody have to say it into Yeshua's ear?
Well, again, Hashem is telling Moshe to inscribe this in a book, right? And to apparently tell it over to Yeshua.
So why is he limiting it to Yeshua?
Good. So in other words, what's Yeshua's role in this pasuk, right? What exactly does this mean? Good. Anything else? Yeah.
Two things. One is whose hand is on the throne of God,
Okay.
and Hashem will maintain a war against Amalek from generation to generation. So he's saying it will come back again and again, even though before he said to obliterate it.
Right. So I think his that. So let me just take the last part, and then because of the other stuff we're gonna try to work there, is the idea that there are a few things. We're in this whole section, right? We're reaffirming this idea of the war is going to continue, right? The war is going to continue until a place called Mechias Amalek, till the obliteration of Amalek. That the impression that we get here is God's responsibility. Okay. So again, it's not that there was an obliteration at the end of 14 and then they're back in 16, right? That there's the book and the telling, right? That is the first topic that affirms this idea that God is going to have it. And then there is the building of the Mizbeach and this oath, right? Or the statement that the war is going to continue into the future, right? And they're not, it's not that one, it's not stage one and stage two, right? They're both ways of describing the same reality, if that makes sense. Okay, good, Judy.
Two things. I guess we can get back to this if you don't want the valuation right now, but the ears of Josh, to tell it in the ears, makes me think of the difference between hearing and listening.
Okay.
And then the other thing is that Moshe built the altar and called its name Hashem is my miracle, which I think is an interesting phrasing as opposed to Hashem performs miracles.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why it's also possible to read it as Hashem is my banner, right? Or Hashem is my, which again, if you take the approach that we suggested before, right, that Moshe is holding the staff on the mountain rather than prayer, or maybe in addition to being prayer, is actually kind of like used as like a signal to the fighters as to what to do in battle, right? That interpretation kind of leans in that direction. Nina.
Judy, I love the educator behind that distinction. It's so good.
Thank you.
Do we have other instances of something being told in someone's ear?
Sounds familiar. I can't.
Does it?
Yeah. No. It's familiar from here.
So the fact that
hold
it
on,
says seem like you should put it in the ear, the word before is the book. So it could be that somewhat it's related to the book. You should give it to Yoshua and tell him about it.
Well, the book is for all
It's-
time.
But why doesn't it just tell them about it? Why is it
Because
put
you
in
have the word book just before the word seem. To me, it's kind of almost attached. What is Vegas for that? So it's בספר, ושים באוזני יהושע, almost because you have the book.
But you
You can put it in the
The book is
book.
for posterity, the book
Right.
is for the future. Now,
But
you wanna
it's
make
also
sure
the
that
book
ear is
and
in
the-
right now.
And the Torah in the ear.
striking me at the moment. The right way to do this is just to do a computer search on Word.
That's
right?
what I was.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So let's.
You did come to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the way we would have done it 30 years ago. We're on Shabbos, yeah.
When I describe this shir to people, what you just did is what I described. And we are so honored.
Strange lulls where the teacher disappears.
So
It's a great time to like sharpen your pencil or pass.
Go to the Shabbos farm, go, I know exactly what I need. And you'll be going through and then you'll find a footnote. Yeah, that was it.
I was many years ago, I was at it doesn't matter where, I was at a shul, very kind of Levitic environment, and there was like some dancing going on during Kabbalah Shabbos, and the rabbi who was going to like give the Torah before Mariv turned to me just like randomly, like just like a kid who was there, said, can you get me 2 svarim for my shtender? I was like, which ones? He's like, whatever, it doesn't matter. So you don't know whether I'm looking anything up or, just, Okay, last questions. Yes, Shoshana and then Elaine, I'm sorry. Or Elaine.
Put it in the ears, just like put that in your ears. So that you'll
Yes, in other words.
Put it in your heart, because if it's in your heart, then you have internalized it. To put it in your ears.
Yeah, good, okay. I accept the questions. That's much. Yeah, Shoshana.
One thought is that the book
yeah,
and the recite is this
I saw
What-
some.
yeah.
other-
idea of like the written and the oral law, like that there's kind of a written component and an oral component here.
Interesting.
So that's one thing.
That's
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
I see that Yehuda, when in front of Joseph, he says, "Can ידבר נא עבדך דבר באוזני אדוני." Can I say something in your ear? So
Right. So that might be different because that might mean in that context that Yehuda wants to talk privately. He specifically doesn't want the good. Okay, terrific. So before we get to any of the questions, I just want to point something out that I think is worthwhile. And the perhaps is paralleled in something that we have before. Okay. The Ibn Ezra says that this section is actually, at least Pasuk Yudal, maybe more, it's not a flashback, it's a flash forward, right? And that this does not take place sequentially where it is here, but actually takes place at the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, right? And it was just before Moshe dies, and as the Torah is coalescing, right? Again, that the Torah comes to the form that we have it now, right on the last day of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, right? And the idea that there were certain sections, right, that are out of order, right? So we have a very good example of one of those questions at the end of the story of the month, right? So if you remember, right, there's this whole business that first of all, it says they ate the month for 40 years, right? Which makes sense that they said that at the end of 40 years. And there's this business of preserving this for the future, right? Take the month, put it in a jar, right? Put the jar in front of the luchos, the aron, right, which didn't exist, right, when the month started falling, right? And that is kind of interposed into the end of the story, right? Because it's kind of the conceptual conclusion to the story, right? And there's the idea that like we're going to fast forward 40 years, right, without telling us, right? In terms of kind of delivering that idea. The Ibn Ezra says the same thing is true. Is that this is what's happening right at the end of 40 years, and that goes on. That in fact, if we're going to take that approach, there are a number of interesting things that are connected. Number one, right, the idea that it could be Sozo Zikaron B'Sefer, right, is actually a reference, right, to the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek as found in Sefer Dvarim. Right? That God, at the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, says, don't forget to make sure that this mitzvah appears, right, in the Torah as well. Right? That it has to, and again, there are a number of versions that assume that's what Sefer means here. Right? That Sefer is a reference to the Torah itself, right? That's, for instance, the Ramban understands that is the case, right? That this is, and he says, "V'zoa mitzvah shekasu lanu b'mishnah Torah." Right? That's the mitzvah that we find in Sefer Dvarim. Right? So that's one, perhaps. And again, why is he telling Yoshua? Right? Well, this is part of kind of the charge, right, to Yoshua, right, in terms of his leadership going forward. Right? In other words, that you are going to. I'm dying, right? Amalek is still out there, but you should know now it's on you to kind of continue this business, right? And that the kind of the responsibility now rests in your hands, right? Even though Yeshua himself does not actually practically deal with this idea. The Chizkuni says that's approach number one. Approach number two is to say, we'll go back to the question of the Sefer, right? What's the Sefer? So again, this already goes back to the Chizkuni says this is one of the many lost books, right, from the time of the Torah, right? The Torah itself references a number of places books that don't exist. And it don't exist today, right? There is a book called Sefer Melchamos Hashem, the Book of the Wars of Hashem, which the Chizkuni suggests would be a very logical candidate for this Sefer. And where do you write about a book, about a war, except in some kind of a chronicle of wars? But he says there are many examples of this where Tanakh will go. There's a book called Sefer Yoshar, a book called Sefer L'Malchei Yisrael, right? And there's that other books existed and they didn't survive, right? And many books don't survive. Separately, he suggests that this book, right, was some kind of, let's call it, manual for the leaders of the Jewish people, right? And there's the idea that there was, again, this is all supposition, right? But the idea that there was kind of a question of like, what does it mean to be a Jewish leader? What are your responsibilities? What are your things, right? And that the idea that this is written down in this other book, right? In other words, whatever exactly is in this book, right? And also communicated directly to Yehoshua, right? And there was the idea that maybe it's your responsibility to convey this Masorah, right? This tradition into the future, right? So that's another possibility. And the Torah points out, right, that it's interesting, right, that if you look at the way the Torah and Sefer Dvarim presents the mitzvah Mechias Amalek, it says that it's supposed to take place right, when God gives you rest from all of your enemies surrounding you. In other words, the war against Amalek is not the first priority, right? First, there has to be a certain level, let's call it, of stability, right, from other enemies before you go after Amalek, right? So the conquest of Canaan, right, is Yeshua's mandate, right? That's where he's going to go, and he's the one who begins that process, right? After he finishes, then if he finishes within his lifetime career, the next step is Mechias Amalek, or again, to convey the book, the oral tradition, both, whatever it is, to convey that on to future generations of leaders. Now, it's an interesting question of if all of this is correct, right? And the reason why Yoshua is being informed about these things is because he is the next leader. He is the one who's going to do Kibush Haaretz, who's going to conquer the land first, right? So that's another reason, right, if we're going to take those approaches, to suggest that this actually takes place at the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. In other words, we would assume, right, that at this fork in the road in the story, Moshe thinks he's taking the Jews into Eretz Yisrael, right, within the next few months. Right? And there's no 40 years, there's no anything about that. And so forth. It's interesting that Rashi, who does read this as sequential, says something very, very interesting. and kind of mysterious. He says, "Kan nirmaz lo Moshe, sheYoshua machnis es Yisrael aretz." Here it is hinted to Moshe that Yoshua is going to be the one who takes them in. Now, that's a very interesting idea. And there's the idea that Moshe already is being given these like subtle messages that things are not going to go the way that you thought. And that kind of raises the question, like, why would that be an important message for Moshe to know? Are these warnings? Are these like I don't really know what to do with that. It's intriguing. So on the one hand, right? In other words, on the one hand, if we're going to treat this as sequential, right, it's almost like an elephant in the room, with one exception. It could be that Yoshua is being told just simply, right, he's the one who started this, right? He started this fighting. And again, remember we said before, he hasn't finished the job, right? Maybe he can't, maybe God tells him. I remember Hashem says, Rashi says that this is al pi hadibur, that it must be Hashem said, Ad kan, right? Until here, you're fighting, and now, and maybe that's really the function of this last section of like, this is something that's bigger than here and now, right? This is a process that's going to have to play itself out long term, right? And why does Yoshua have to be told? Not Yoshua's going to take it, but almost like a comfort to Yoshua of like, don't see this as a personal failure that you didn't get this done, right? This is bigger than you, right? Rashi, though, it's interesting, doesn't take that approach, and instead quotes this measure that's a hint to Moshe about what's going to happen in the future. I'm not really sure why that should be the case. That's all I have to say about that for now. Elaine, did you have your hand up before? Oh, Shana. Go ahead.
Is there yet a concept of Mashiach? Or
I don't know what that means.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
I mean, Yeshua sounds like kind of saved, like being saved.
Okay.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Why? What would the next part of your thought process be?
I don't know, like right now in a different, like Chani Silver's class where we're doing, whatever you say his name in Hebrew, Yeshaya. And we're on chapter 11 where it talks a lot about Mashiach and what will transpire during those times. And it's just, I'm just wondering how this pertains to that. There's a lot about ingathering and the peace, like the lion, the wolf and the lamb, and all of that. So yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm just trying to see, because this extends into the future, and does the war of Gog and Magog occur before Amalek or after? Like, I don't know. I'm just curious.
Okay. So to say about right. I guess the last thing I say, like, there is something, and I just there's something very intriguing about the idea that somehow in the back of his mind, Moshe knows, half knows, suspects, right, that things are not going to be as smooth as he thinks. I don't know what to do with that, but I'll leave it to you. And then you can think about it.
Does he know yet that he's not getting into Israel?
No. In other words, if this is sequential, definitely not.
Is this sort of poignant here, or emotional? He's transferring his authority to somebody else.
Well, again, I'm going to flip it around. In other words, that's one of the interpretive questions of what's going on here, right? If you want to read it that way, again, this approach that says this all transpires in year 40, right? Then we understand against the backdrop of everything about the transition from Moshe to Yoshua, right? And again, that's part of what, to me, kind of commends that approach, right? If we're going to assume that it happens in the 40th year, and it happens sequentially, right? Then I would think the more straightforward way to read it is This is Yeshua as the person who started the mitzvah. Right? He was Yeshua, this is his portfolio, right? He was delegated to to deal with it. And that's why he's talking to them about it, very simply. It's the combination of, and this is Rashi, right? That if you're going to keep it sequential, right? And that somehow it has to do with Yeshua's role as the Machnis La'aretz, as the one who takes them in to Eretz Yisrael, then yeah, and there's the question of like, it's maybe poignant, it's maybe, again, the phrasing that Rashi uses here is as near Maslow, right? It was hinted to him, right? So I guess I'm leaving that if that's the scenario, right? Then, what are the ramifications to Moshe? What are the ramifications to Yeshua of that statement, right? Is maybe, that again, is this a scene? Maybe both of them don't really understand the implication of what it means. And we as the reader, right, are the one who are being introduced to, even though again, like obviously the reader knows what happens for the most part at the end of the story anyways, right? But the point is that this scene maybe for us, right, is very poignant, just because the protagonists don't really understand the significance of what, maybe that's it. Maybe that's I don't know. Yeah.
So Moshe chose Yeshua to fight Amalek.
Yes.
But now God is telling Moshe to put this into the ears of Yeshua.
Mm-hmm.
So did Moshe choose him because, I'm confused about who decided that Yeshua was going to be the one to lead the people into. I mean, did God say, he did the battle, so now we'll choose him?
Right. So that's actually, again, we talked a little bit of, is this Moshe's decision? Is this, because again, it doesn't tell us how Moshe came to that decision. Right. And again, we saw the Mefarshim, they're critical of him for having made that decision. Other Mefarshim that said that this was absolutely the correct pick as far as it's concerned.
But that was for the battle. So now we're hearing that, now on the other side, God is saying.
Got it. So again, let's go back to our three possibilities. If the significance of this is that Yeshua is the one who started the fight, and this is a communication about the continuation, then again, it seems like God is probably approving of the choice, or de facto the die is cast, as it were. And now this is Yeshua. And again, essentially we're going to read it as this is kind of a chizah, right? A strengthening to Yeshua of like, don't feel bad about the fact that you didn't finish the job yet. Right? And there's like, realize that this was not just a one-day business, but this is something that is much bigger. Possibility number two, let me make sure I have all the possibilities in my head. Possibility number two is, if we want to read this is happening at the end of the 40 years, right? So Yeshua has proven himself at that point again and again, the whole business of the spies. He's already been picked to be leader by God for reasons that maybe don't have to deal primarily with the war against Amalek, right? And that under his role as future leader, Machnis La'aretz, the one who brings the Jewish people into Eretz Yisrael, right? That he has, the Amalek portfolio underneath that, right? If we want to take the Rashi approach, right, that this is something that is happening sequentially, right, and is also about the future, right? Again, theoretically, I guess you could use this as kind of confirmation of the interpretive approach that says Yeshua was the divine selection for king and future leader, and that's why he was given this particular battle, right? And then there's something that's a little bit of like, what's the chicken and what's the egg, right? And then, and again, just to go back to my hobby horse for a minute, that to some degree, this goes back to like one of the basic hashkafic questions about counterfactuals and human choice. In other words, that and that, by the way, is part of, I didn't want to go down that road at the moment, but like part of what made me hesitate in terms of your question about Mashiach at this, what does Mashiach mean at this juncture in history, right? I think that there is a whole spectrum, right? There is on the one hand this idea, right, that the Mashiach, the name of Mashiach, right, predates creation, right? And again, and that very much sees this idea, what, I'm sorry? Yeah. And there's all that stuff on the one hand seems to be very much on kind of a predetermined stage of history, right? On the other hand, right, in other words, that today, right, and Rambam says that this is a matter of Ikari Emunah, right, of fundamental beliefs, right? So Mashiach has to be descended from David HaMelech, right? So does that mean, right, that David was too big to fail, right? There had to be a David HaMelech figure before and afterwards. Could it have been someone else, right? And then again, that goes into the question of like, let's say Shaul had not sinned the way that he sinned, right? Is it possible that the Malchus would have been given in perpetuity, right, to the house of Shaul, right? Again, that's to me why I find these issues so interesting and so important to think about, right? Because again, it's almost like it's a very strong, very concrete way, right, of dealing with a philosophical question of how does God's plans, right, and our own choices, how do they interact with each other, right? Which again is a paradox, right? But I think is like a very, you know, like it touches on how we understand the whole idea of nevuah and so forth. And I didn't really want to get into that, so I didn't answer your question. And I think the same thing is true of like, you know, that was this always predestined? It was going to be Yeshua. Was this something that was a series of forks in the road that got there? Are the forks in the road in every scenario? Do you somehow wind up with Yeshua being a leader? That's interesting. It's a little bit of a generational thing, although perhaps you experienced this as parents. Some of you say there was this in the 80s. There was this series of books called Choose Your Own Adventures, right? And like it's if you pick up this, go to page 87. If you run screaming, go to page 95. And what's interesting is those books, sometimes and who knows, maybe this is part of what planted this thinking in my head as a child, right? But that it's interesting, sometimes with these books, right, it's the idea is that there are all kinds of endings, right? And there's that the ending is not predetermined, but just a question of, and what you do is going to determine the ending. And what's interesting is with some of them, if I recall correctly, or maybe there are endings that are either more likely than others, right? There's an ending that there's only really one path to get to that ending, and 90% of the paths that you're on are all going to end at the same ending. And it's more of a question of how you get there and how much is. And that also is a model within thinking about these kinds of ideas, right? So again, I would say that there always is going to be some kind of redemption, some kind of redeemer, right? Is the question of, does that mean, right? There's an idea people talk about it being a potential Mashiach in every generation, right? Where that comes from, I don't know offhand. But the point is, in other words, like that affirms the idea of the fluidity and flexibility, right? Within, there's going to be a redemption, there's going to be a redeemer, but how we get there and who it's going to be, right, is very, very fluid. And maybe, again, it's only after David successfully does what he has to do that becomes associated with David HaMelech and so. Next time. Right. And there's all of that is like, again, it's the paradox of Rabbi Akiva, that he says, Hakol tzfuya v'arishus mesuna, everything is foreseen and free will is given. And like, maybe that's not even our problem to work out how that's supposed to be. Both of those things are true at the same time. All right, we will stop here. We're going to start Rosh Hashanah next week. But let me just actually think about the timing. Yeah, we'll finish up. We'll start Rosh Hashanah. And then I think the week afterwards, we'll do, it's probably the last time we'll do it. We'll do the annual, what did we learn the last year that we can bring to the Seder session, right? Again, this year we did, we did B'Shalach and Az Yashir, and there's definitely stuff that is very much like meaty Seder stuff. Next year, the pickings are going to be, more strained, but maybe we'll try it anyways. I don't know if this is a useful exercise for you or not to, be able to, the joke is always in the yeshivas and seminaries in Israel, they load them up with like stuff on the Haggadah when they come home for Pesach, right? Because like you want to show the parents the return on their investment before you drop the bomb that they want another year of tuition, right? Place before. Good. All right, Parasha tonight, at 8:15. Again, a reminder that we are having, for those of you who have a taste for Tanakh, that we will be hosting Rabbi Yitzchak et Shalom this Shabbos as its own residence. And again, thank you, those of you who sponsored. Thank you for your sponsorship. Those of you who still would like to sponsor, can stop in with Miriam on your way out. There's a whole schedule. All of the shiurim are somehow connected to the Haggadah, or kind of Tanakh insights into Haggadah ideas already. If you're in, right, there's no cleaning you can do on Shabbos anyways, right? So if you want to prepare for Pesach in a different kind of way, it's going to be great material. He's a great presenter. He also, for those of you who don't know, the tune in Hallel to Ma'ashiv, right, that is kind of the peasy tune. Ma'ashiv was composed by Yitzchak. That is his original composition. So he's a kind of talented musician as well. He's going to be davening Kabbalah Shabbos Friday night in Shul. So again, anybody wants to, because of the way that we have him set up Shabbos morning, that he's speaking at the Kiddush following the first minyan and then speaking at the second minyan, it doesn't really work for him to be able to do a Shabbos morning slot as far as that's concerned. And that was, I weighed that when I was making the schedule, decided rather, for a variety of reasons, he's on the schedule. Okay, so he's speaking at a sit-down Kiddush after the 8 o'clock minyan. He's speaking, there's no speech during davening this week, right? So, sorry. And then after the main Kiddush, there's going to be a shiur after the main Kiddush, right? So that's like roughly, I'm sorry?
So that's like
11:45 maybe.
Also,
and then he's, what time is he doing?
Yeah, so also there's a group that I really sincerely invite you to join, Learning Nachomi. It's an app from the OU. It's a 10-minute tape each day. And Rabbi Echelon is just such an expert. He's so excited to hear on Nach.